Welcome, geometry students. Today we're going to be talking about target 1.2, which is to find the length and midpoint of a segment in the coordinate plane. Okay, so there's two important definitions to start with. The first is midpoint of a segment, and the second is segment bisector. You're going to find that these two terms have a lot in common, but one big difference. So the first term is midpoint of a segment. So the midpoint is the point, it has to be an ordered pair, or an XY coordinate, the point that divides a segment into two congruent. The symbol for congruent, by the way, is an equal sign with a wave above it. So it's a point that divides a segment into two congruent parts. Okay, so it's a point directly in the middle on a segment. So we have segment AB. Our midpoint will divide it into two congruent parts. A segment bisector is a point, a ray, a line, or line segment, or plane that intersects a segment at its midpoint. So this definition, by the way, midpoint, that's the abbreviation there for that. This particular definition says that it could be a point, but it could also be a ray, line segment, or plane. So what we have going on here is very similar, where we're dealing with a segment and we're dealing with its midpoint. But it doesn't just have to be a point that's dividing the segment into two equal parts. It could be a ray, it could be a line, it could be a plane, and so forth. The big idea is this: a segment bisector could be any one of these things that's dividing the segment into two equal parts by traveling through the midpoint, whereas a midpoint has to be a point. So that's the major difference. So the segment bisector bisects the segment by cutting it in half, and the midpoint does the same, but it has to be a point. Let's continue on. In the skateboard design, VW bisects segment XY at point T, and XT is 58.7 centimeters. Find the length of XY. Pictures are so important to us in geometry, so if you ever find that you're struggling with a problem, please take a moment to draw a picture. We also want to, in this case, since we were provided a picture, we want to put any information we have about it onto our picture. So it tells us right here some really important information. Sorry about that. Okay, back to that. It tells us some really important information right here. It says that segment VW bisects segment XY. Therefore, the first segment is what's doing the bisecting. The first segment, meaning in the phrase VW in this case, is what's cutting XY in half. So VW is not necessarily being bisected, does not tell us that. It's instead this length XY that's being bisected or cut in half by this segment VW. Point T is the point at which that occurs, so point T in this case is the midpoint. It also tells us the length of XT is 58.7 centimeters. Well, we need to find the length of XY. Since T is a midpoint, that means the length of XY is congruent to the length of TY. So if I want to know this entire length, all I need to realize is that this segment is the same as this segment. So therefore, the length of XY is the same as 58.7 times 2. So XY is really the same as 117.4 centimeters. If you notice, I labeled my answer in two ways. I labeled what it is, the length of XY, and I labeled the units. Example 2 says point M is a midpoint. So in this case, the key word here is midpoint. Those words are so important to us, and they really tell us what to do for the problem. So if M is a midpoint, that means it divides the segment into two equal parts, hence these tick marks. So that means the length of VM is equal to the length of MW. So we want to find the length of VM. Again, I'm labeling my picture so I know exactly what I'm doing. So since I know these two segments are congruent, that means that they're equal in length. So when I'm working with this, I'm going to set up an equation that shows that the first segment, 3c minus 8, is equal to the second segment, or 2c plus 4. Now that I have my equation, all I need to do is use my algebra skills from last year to bring my variable terms to one side of the equation and my constants to the opposite side. So I'm going to add 8 to both sides, and I find that c is equal to 12. Now in algebra we would be done here because really we were just asked to solve the equation in most situations last year. But this doesn't say to find c, it says to find the length of Vm. Well, Vm is this length here. Vm is equivalent to 3c minus 8. So I need to continue on to find Vm by using my c amount and plugging that in. So I'll evaluate this by inserting my c value into my expression, and I find that Vm is a length of 28 units. All right, this says that the coordinates of the midpoint of a segment are the averages of the x coordinates and y coordinates of the endpoints of the segment. So it says if we want to calculate the midpoint of a segment, we're just going to take the averages of the x and y coordinates to do that. So the formula is written as capital M is equal to x1 plus x2. Like any other average, we're going to divide by how many? Y1 plus y2. And that's our midpoint formula. Let's look at that in action. Example 3 says the endpoints of segment RS are 5, negative 6, and S is negative 12, negative 7. Find the coordinates of the midpoint M. All right, we're going to start with our formula, and anytime we're using a formula, we're going to write it down. That means in our homework assignment, we're going to write it down for each and every problem. In our classwork, we're going to write it down, in our videos and so forth. Why? Because that's going to help us to recall this formula when we're being quizzed or tested on it. So we're going to take the average of the x values. Well, all ordered pairs go in the order go in the order of x, y. So if I'm looking at the x values, this is my first point, this is my second point. Order in which you put those is really not an issue. So you could put them in either order. So I'm going to take my x value from the first point and my x value from the second point and add them together. So 5 added with negative 12 divided by 2. And I'm going to do the same thing with the y's. So my y value from the first point is negative 6. Added with negative 7, my y value from the second point. And when I simplify that, I find that M is equal to, meaning the midpoint is equal to, negative 7 halves, negative 13.2. So that's my ordered pair. Remember, the midpoint is the point that's between these, that's bisecting that segment. So it should be an ordered pair, and it should have parentheses. Now, because we're dealing with an ordered pair, a decimal is probably more appropriate, or a fraction is probably more appropriate than an improper fraction. So I know that the midpoint of this segment, RS, is negative 3.5, negative 6.5. We're going to save part B of this till tomorrow in class, so just go ahead and leave that blank for now. I would not try it because it is different from part A. All right, the next formula we're going to be talking about today is the distance formula. The distance formula is used to find the distance between 2 points. So the midpoint finds the middle of those 2 points. The distance formula is going to find the distance between them, so how long the segment is. So this is also known as the length. So you'll use this formula in 2 regards. Once when it says to find the distance between the points, and you can also use this formula when it says to find the length of the segment. This formula can be written as d is equal to the square root of x2 minus x1, x2 minus x1, quantity squared, plus y2 minus y1 quantity squared. And this formula is based on the Pythagorean theorem, which we've learned about earlier in the unit. So if you notice, we have both subscripts and we have a power. So again, this is just labeling which point we're dealing with. Let's take a look at that. What is the approximate length? Remember, length is the same as distance of segment RS. This particular segment has the endpoint of R and S. So since we're finding the length, we don't want the midpoint formula. We instead want the distance formula, how far it is. Again, like I said before, we're going to write that formula each and every time so that we get it from our short-term memory into our long-term memory, and so that we know it when our test comes around. Okay, so again, we have 2 points. We have point 1 and point 2. We're going to go ahead and plug in the information, and we have to just remember to go in the same order. So in other words, if I start with this point for my x values, I have to start with that exact same point for my y values. So I'm going to start with this point each time. So my x value from point number 2 is 4, and I'm going to take away, subtract, my x value from my first point, in this case 2. Parentheses are very important there. And then I do that again for my y values. My y value from the second point, that's why there's a subscript of 2, is -1. And I'm going to subtract, so watch out for double negatives on this. I'm going to subtract the y value from my first point, which in this case is 3. Make sure your radical goes all the way over the entire problem. Now we're just going to use some algebra to simplify. So 4 minus 2 is simplified to be 2 squared. -1 minus 3 is -4 squared. Well, when I square a quantity, it means to multiply it by itself. So 2 squared is 4. Watch your negative. If you're putting this in your calculator, you need to include the parentheses, or you can just realize that it's the same as -4 times itself, which is going to make a positive. So keep in mind, if you square a quantity, it must be a positive. We can talk about that more in class tomorrow if you're unsure. Okay, so we end up with simplifying that to be the square root of 20. Now that we can't take that perfect, we can't simplify that to be a whole number because it's not a perfect square. But what we can do is go back to simplifying our radical, and we find that we have a pair of 2's. So really this is the same as 2 times 2 times 5. And if you recall from earlier in the week, this is going to be a distance of 2 root 5. So the distance between R and S is 2 root 5 units. All right, well, thanks so much for joining me. We'll talk more about Target 1.2 in class. Until then, have a wonderful day.